So in the gist of this presentation, I guess I'll give you a bit of rundown of my career history so that you know where I'm coming from, the lens that I'm going to present. So I work a fair bit across different facets of business. Being in sales, then I came over from Singapore to Australia to do my postgrad, did a PhD, became a university lecturer. One of my ex-colleague Ferry is also online today. And then probably I had what you call a midlife crisis very early on. So I was wondering if I should be a lecturer for the rest of my life, but I chose to, instead of talking the talk, decided to walk the walk. Left the university, started out as a supply chain planner with an American-based company that helps the likes of Telstra, Samsung manage their inventory in Australia, EE in UK, 2 degrees in New Zealand. So behind some of these gigantic telco companies, there will be a group of perhaps a company like Brightstar that helps them manage the analytics and the supply chain planning aspect. And then prior to COVID, I guess I was quite fortunate. A role and opportunity came up with Australia Post. That was 2019. I joined them as their optimization manager, looking after the retail function. So to many people, Australia Post is a logistics transport company, right? A delivery company. But behind that engine sits 3,500 retail stores that rarely people talk about. So I'm talking about the 3,500 retail post office that we see, which 700 are corporate owns and the remaining are licensees, which we call LPOs. So pretty much there is a function within Auspost that looks around 30 of us that looks after all the inventory that goes into this poster outlets. So and then a year and a half into my optimization portfolio, I was asked to lead a team that looks at the forecast and the replenishment of all the inventory for these 700 stores. And just recently, I joined a startup, Reebelo, that aims, that is also along with the line of the theme of sustainability, looking at how we can repackage refurb devices and sell it to the consumers, trying to minimize e-waste and creating a circular economy. So pretty much my lens in terms of supply chain optimization that I'm going to go through today is pretty much looking at a very high level in terms of how we set up supply chain networks rather than going down the nitty-gritty of process or within the function. So in terms of the agenda, I'll go through the state of play. What some of you will probably know what things that are we supply chain professions are facing daily, or in terms of the challenges, in terms of the disruptions and the volatility. I'll talk a little bit about optimization initiatives and what areas we need to look at. But ultimately, I guess optimization revolves around one key proposition, one notion, and that's customer service and experience. And lastly, I'll just cap it off in terms of the next stages of supply chain optimization, the evolution itself. So really quickly, I think this is something that everyone could appreciate. For those who are practitioners or operating in supply chain, I mean, the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen the down and lows of supply chain, market pressures coming from lockdowns, and lockdowns are still happening in some Asian countries such as China. So, and we are facing new variants. Masks are recommended to be on again. We are looking at shortage of raw materials, production delays, shipping delays, isolation of workforce still happening in different parts of the world. And again, increasing fuel, probably as a result of the Ukraine war, there has been a lot of volatility in the fossil fuel prices. Skilled workers, Luke spoke a little bit about it. We do see a shortage of skilled workers, especially in the agriculture sector. Australia as a whole has been very reliant, have been very fortunate that we have always a really positive growth in terms of migrant workers and so on. But all this value proposition or this benefit has sort of dried up in the last 2 years due to COVID. So, and we're also facing increasing amount of natural disasters. Just look at I have if you look at the slide, that picture of the flood on the right pretty much illustrates some of the communities that are going through the harsh time. In New South Wales recently, we had the floods. And even in Victoria itself, in Melbourne itself, we have the flooding of the river itself. So these are the things that we are constantly facing. It's not a one-off. In the past, we tend to talk about black swan events, but I think in recent times, these are no longer considered black swan events or one-off. And inflation and geopolitics added to the mix, right? I mean, inflation, everyone's facing increasing mortgage prices, everything, as you can see from your average grocery shopping price, the value, the pricing has gone up. And geopolitics within the Pacific region isn't really helping. So, I mean, if you think about it, for some of you educators who are online right now, the golden era of globalization that we used to preach is pretty much gone. When countries are friendly, trade were very thriving. Now it's all about looking at security. It's all about looking at self-sufficient. It's all about being able to manage the risk within your supply chain. So that conversation has changed just within the last 3 years. So what does that mean for supply chain optimization? So one of the things that perhaps most of you who are in supply chain planning roles or inventory planning roles will be very familiar with is that often with supply chain, we are managing demand, but at the same time, we need to try to proactively forecast the demand. But having said that, often we do know that there is decoupling points within a supply chain network or supply chain itself. So ideally, for us within logistics or supply chain, we like a very stable operating environment that we can use forecasts to drive our stability, our volume, so that we can leverage on economics of scale and we can manage the demand much more appropriately. When things are stable, it's much more easier to manage. That's the fundamentals of supply chain best practice. Keeps things stable, less volatility, less variation. You keep things easy and you can achieve cost efficiencies really quickly. So, but having said that, right now, if you look at the global view, downstream and upstream are very dissynchronized because we have spoken about all the volatilities in the previous slide. It creates a lot of variations, it creates a lot of noise whereby our forecasts no longer stand. You can predict a forecast, yes. Supply chain demand planners will predict a forecast, but what if you're constrained by the supply? So again, you can forecast for 10,000 units for this Christmas peak, but your supply is going to deliver 4,000. So what's the point of doing a forecast in the first place? So again, there is that I would say that challenge that will exist in the new norm, where volatility is driven by external pressures and market pressures would add to the complexity of the current supply chain environment. But having said that, we always need to create a strategy, a baseline to try to manage the volatility. And as part of any effective supply chain strategy is try to make sure that the volatility sits at upstream as possible. That means your demand penetration point is as far upstream as possible. So you can leverage on economics of scale and stability to move the efficiency and drive the cost to serve down. So that's where ultimately, that's one of the underlying principles of optimization. How can you manage the volatility and drive the demand penetration point upstream as much as possible? So other forms of optimization. So I spoke about sales and ops. So some of you might be familiar with sales and ops planning, IBP. But having said that, one of the things is that that's one part of optimization that we carry out for inventory management. But depending on what roles you are working in supply chain, you will also need to do other forms of optimization. So inventory lot size. So if you're a supply planner or you're a production planner, you will constantly struggle with the issues of, should I go with a just-in-time, creating small batches, or should I look at MOQ? So that's the other part where you're looking at optimizing cost efficiencies versus reducing inventory costs. If you go down the path of MOQ, a minimum order quantity, but what if your demand forecast is not accurate? You over forecast. Would it be better for you to create a just in time when demand drops and then you start to build, you start to produce to it? So that's one of the optimization that supply chain people will need to look at. And if you're in the transport sector, again, truckload versus less than truckload. Truckload, you optimize economics of scale. Less than truckload, you leverage on speed. You deliver faster, yeah? So again, different parts of the supply chain requires different parts of optimization lens to look at. And again, if you are working in the merch side of the business, merchandise planning, product variety versus inventory cost will be a struggle. You want to give variety to customers, provide them with more options, but you add unnecessary complexity into your supply chain by adding too much variance. And by adding more variety, of course, you may have that customer proposition. We are giving you more choices, yes. But think about from the inventory cost perspective, your COGS, cost of goods to produce them, to store them. When I was a lecturer, I always tell my kids or my students that, yes, so long as the product is not paid for by the customer, not carried out from your store, and it is hanging somewhere or it's being stored somewhere in a warehouse or is it moving in truck, someone is still paying for it. And it's an internal cost. So by expanding the variety, you're actually increasing more shelf space to display them. You have to increase more warehouse space to store them. But at the same time, you increase the goods, the cost of goods itself. So these are also the types of optimization that a really good function or supply chain professionals needs to really look at. Different lens depending on which sector you're working on, or if you're managing end-to-end pipeline. So I'll talk a little bit about the supply chain paradox. Everyone preaches that, oh, as a supply chain network, as a supply chain part entity, we need to synchronize our activities. We need to carry out CPFR. We need to do SNOP with our suppliers. We need to do IBP. Yes, I get that. That is best practice. But if you really dig down in terms of the KPIs, if you dig and take a look at the KPIs, you realize that we exist in a very paradoxical state. Why? So let's do a bit of role play here. If you were a manufacturer, if you're a factory, what would allow you to hit your KPIs? Pretty much you will be thinking, oh, I would like to have stable production runs with minimum volatility itself. I like to train my factory workers, my workforce to be able to produce one type of product very efficiently at the most cost-effective price. I don't need to retrain them. I don't need to reorganize my production facilities for different variety. So ultimately, what you're thinking is, as a production manager, leveraging economics of scale. But on the other hand, if you will want to source for raw supplies as a production manager, will you want to buy in bulk from your raw suppliers? Will you want to commit your capital to bulk raw ingredients or raw supplies? You wouldn't, because for you, you want to reduce your liability. Yeah. So you're not willing to commit to large bulk supplies from your raw suppliers, but you yourself want to have batch runs, bulk batch production runs. So that exists that paradoxical situation itself. Likewise, that situation happens on different stages of the supply chain. And if you look at from a retailer's perspective, they also want to, because of their limited store capacity, they wouldn't want the warehouse to send bulk pallets of a single product. They want variety of different products. But then if you're working in a warehouse, you say that adds complexity to my picking. I will rather pick one type of product and send to the retail store. So that paradox exists within all supply chain because we have a different wish list. We have different KPIs to hit. So as supply chain professions or logistics professions, I think one of the things that we need to practice is empathy when we look at the bigger picture. Why the suppliers are pushing you to buy a larger volume. Why your customer wants a smaller volume and they don't want to buy to your MOQ. So that appreciation, the empathy is really required for optimization. So if you think in the greater scheme of things, ultimately supply chain serves one ultimate customer, and that's the end consumer, be it a digital supply chain, be it a physical supply chain. In recent times, we talk about inflation, increasing cost of production and goods and services. There has been a lot of talk. How do we get the cost to serve down? Because ultimately, everything is going up except for salary. So if you think from a supply chain practitioner perspective, reducing inventory, manufacturing costs, and transport costs typically comes at the expense of customer service. Your SLAs, your service levels is hard to maintain. But at the same time, we have gone through the so-called Uberization of the consumerism. What do I mean by the Uberization of consumers? Basically, we have created a new set of behavior in the last 5 years. Convenience now sits as one of the biggest value proposition in driving how we manage supply chain. So for those who are living in Australia, you would have seen this news article that came out just yesterday. Coles now wants to allow for 60 minutes click and collect. Amazon in US has allowed for single day delivery or within a few hours delivery services. That is the convenience I'm talking about. That's going to drive future consumer behavior. So when we think about supply chain optimization, the end goal is what's the value proposition are we going to achieve? And how can we service the customers and retain the revenue? So the evolution of supply chain optimization, I think one of the things is I always like to fall back on the theories, given that due to my academic background, will be driven by several factors, right? It's an ongoing exercise because in this in the operating climate that we are in, things are very volatile. So it is something that probably I would say there's no end goal. You can optimize based on your current circumstances, but it will be driven by a few factors. So this is a very useful framework that a lot of the academics would have used for their research in the past. It's called the Technology, Organization, and Environment Framework. So it sort of suggests that innovation and decision-making tend to rely on 3 different dimensions. Technology, so which I'm going to talk a little bit in the later slide, how available it is to the organization, to the users, and what sort of characteristics the technology. So we talk about, and technology is not just about software. EV, electrical vehicles, are also a form of technology. Solar, a form of technology. Robotics, a form of technology. That is one part of where supply chain managers and practitioners needs to look at. And that's that landscape constantly change. Yeah, we are in an era where technology is just going at such a fast pace right now. But at the same time, you also look at the external environment we are operating in. And that goes back to my first slide that I talk about the market pressures. What is the industry characteristics and what's the market structure? And what are the technological support infrastructure? If we want to leverage on technology, there needs to be a backbone. So we talk about whether there's the right ambient network in a particular state to support certain satellite technology for farms, for example. That could be the backbone that we are talking about. There's a lot of talk about drones in the last 5 years, but there's no regulation to support it. Domino's, I think I recall 5 years ago, came out with a very fancy advert for using drones to deliver pizza. But no news of drones trying to do the last mile now, because regulation has not progressed. You haven't seen drones being applied on a commercial scale. Organization itself. How fluid, how flexible, and how agile your organization can move from one state to another state. As organizations grow organically, be it by revenue or because of market share, one of the things that will kick in will be bureaucracy, red tapes, and so on. So the ability to change becomes very low. The inertia becomes really high. What we meant by slack. So taking into account this 3 dimension, one of the things is these are what enables supply chain optimization and transformation. So when Sri invited me to talk a little bit about emerging trends in supply chain, I gave a very serious thought about it. I was like saying, optimization has been happening for eons now, for ages. But what are the key emerging trends that will happen or are important or pertinent to us within the next 3 to 5 years? So it hasn't changed a lot. Digitization has been happening since internet came around. But what has accelerated right now is that we know that whenever the environment is volatile, information is key to managing the volatility. So organization that wants to look at managing demand and planning to that right demand now needs real-time data. From your POS systems, it can be consolidated, and ultimately, AI and machine learning will kick in. Gone will be the days where demand planners or supply chain planners will be doing spreadsheet crunching, trying to do a forecast using moving average, weighted average, or trying to calculate your forecast accuracy on Excel. All this will be done in the click of a button. But to enable to that stage, where machine can start to run demand planning or production plan, you need to get your data straight. You need to get your data hygienic. But at the same time, Internet of Things, everything are becoming connected. You can switch on your lightings using a mobile phone in recent times. Everything is as what they call IoT enabled. And that's some of the technologies that will come our way. Automation. So right before I left, some of our warehouses in Australia Post are going through the automation path. Gone are the days of human moving boxes, picking and packing. Robots will be doing that for us. And now some of the bigger companies like Tesla and some of the bigger Chinese automotive company are also experimenting autonomous trucks. Those are the things that's going to change the landscape of how we operate our supply chain. So in the pursuit to reduce cost to serve, we now need to look at machines, robots, to help us remove all the manual labor. But what's also very important, and it ties into Luke's speech, is the greening of supply chain. Ethical, environmental friendly supply chains are required. That's part of the change in the consumer behavior. We look at carbon emissions, we look at waste management, we look at EVs, but more importantly, in the context of Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act. The suppliers that need to work with us needs to be compliance. So there's a lot of talk about bringing back manufacturing since COVID. That's also part of risk mitigation, number 4. But that's an interesting one because setting up manufacturing is expensive. And right now, with the increasing costs of labor and materials, I'm not sure how that's going to eventuate in the next 2 to 3 years. And going back to the fact that we may have skill shortages, could it be we are going back to the path of offshoring for certain jobs? And that leads on to item number 5, upskilling of workforce. So gone are the days of people working in warehouse just moving boxes. If we were to deploy robotics into warehouses, the skills to run these sheds will change, will totally change. You will need programmers or people who are IT savvies to know how to fix a robot when it goes down. You need people who can read numbers that are crunched out by machine learning. So that is going to be part of the optimization trend that we will see. Supply chain professions will now be considered, I would say, needs in the next 5 years will need to be considered as a very highly skilled profession because of the type of environment we're going to operate in. There's a bit of soft skills involved. Yes, you still need the soft skills of maintaining relationships, negotiation, and so on. But in terms of the artifacts that we are going to play with, we are going to deploy, it will change quite radically from a landscape perspective. So if you think about what are the areas optimization initiatives needs to address, one is the network itself, where we're going to source for, where we're going to plan for, because that impacts on your lead time, but it also impacts on your risk. We need to remove all the manual laborious processes that exist from our legacy systems or based on how the company has grown historically. Nowadays, we always do it like this, but our statement doesn't work. This is the way that we've always been doing it for years, doesn't work anymore. Because in the pursuit of to reduce the cost, we need to innovate and relook at how and why we need these processes in the first place. The range of our products. So again, bespoke products or generic products will constantly, I guess, as retailers, they will struggle with it. Do we reduce the range or do we strive our business model on variety? That is going back to the business model itself, but the business proposition will drive how you actually plan and manage your supply chain and how you optimize it. For departmental stores, they tend to strive on variety, but that complex the whole supply chain. Again, that's the struggle that we get. Customers, we constantly need to look at how our customer behavior are changing. Nowadays, with the millennials and the younger generation, they tend to buy everything online through social media. Marketing is done online. You have to invest in Google Ads. You have to look at how you can do your search engine optimization. You have to look at your click conversion costs whenever you invest in all these ads. So again, there are a lot of areas. Suppliers, I spoke a little bit about it just now. Organization, yes. How big, how inertial it is to changes. But information, at the end of the day, I think a good supply chain strives on having the right information, but it has to be accurate, timely, and hygienic. And that enables all your fancy technological artifacts to work. So as they say in many parts of the business, junk in, junk out. So I'm always a big believer of making sure that information and data elements within the organization needs to be optimized, needs to be fit for use within the organization itself. So going back to optimization, I think optimization is pretty much trying to transform the business. And I like this table because it comes from one of the reputed professor within the logistics and supply chain domain, Martin Christopher. It sort of classified transformation into 7 key categories. We talk about from supply-centric to customer-centric. This requires us as supply chain professions to have really rich market insights and try to change our supply chain network as quick as possible to meet the demand. So it means that we need to drive very agile supply chain. That also leads on to the next one. Instead of a very forecast, very push-oriented supply chain, now we need to look at pull-oriented, demand-driven planning. That goes back to the idea, the notion of having rich data, understanding your sales, the demand, so that your planning, your production can synchronize really quickly. If your sales and demand data comes in too late, then the whole network or this whole supply chain will react too slow to it. The emphasis will move from inventory to information. So with the right information, we actually can reduce inventory holdings because we know what to plan for, we know what to buy, we know what to build, we know what to sell. And relationship has become a very pertinent topic. So even if you have the money, your supplier may not necessarily want to sell to you in the context of geopolitics. So as you can see, I mean, we are living in a much more volatile from a world with wars happening in Europe and bricks and stones thrown across between the Chinese and the Australians. We are living in a very volatile world. Just because there's a demand doesn't necessarily mean that we are able to service it, because due to other parties, we may be blocked from servicing the market. So relationship is very important too. And from truck to and sheds to end-to-end pipeline management. So that goes back to the fact that as supply chain practitioners or leaders, we need to look at end-to-end and have this empathy for all the parties within the supply chain. But at the same time, we need to have a proper understanding on what does it take to serve that market, to serve that segment. From functions, so we talk about functional optimization, but in my last few slides, I've been emphasizing from end-to-end process optimization, be it upstream or be it downstream. So nowadays, supply chain teams within organization tend to be very cross-functional. They need to have 360 visibility of what's happening upstream and downstream. And instead of standalone competition, it's more about network rivalry, which is pretty much the same. So I mean, how do we create a win-win situation is what I guess a good supply chain team or function would try to achieve. So I guess with this, I would sort of end off my talk with this metaphor. Optimization itself is like gears running constantly. There is no end goal. There is a view that things may change. The only thing we are certain is that change is constant. If you are in the area of supply chain optimization, you need to constantly revisit and see whether the solution that you have deployed is fit for purpose. Thank you.